Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me or if we have a problem. Just realized I might not have got the right mic set up. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Good, 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 good. Welcome, welcome. It's rainy in London. Lovely to have you all here with me. I do not see the questions that came in before. So it's tricky. It's the same problem I had last time, but for some reason I don't see them. I'm going to reflect on why that keeps happening. Meanwhile, you're all very, very welcome. Let's remind ourselves what on earth is going on. So basically, the way it works is that there's a planet, and on the planet live some clever animals, and they get up to different kinds of stuff. And so some of their activities are political. It's a very special kind of activity. And some of their activities are ethical. It's very hard to draw a clear boundary between these two and all their other activities. But we talk about these two activities in particular. And because our conversation is only beginning, there's plenty of, I think, very exciting turns and evolutions to come. And I'm actually interested in doing a chat just on this topic on the chat channel, where we are so far, where I see us going, because in a certain way, given my own limitations, it's a miracle how far this community has come and how far this conversation has come. On the other hand, it's nowhere near being where it's traveling toward yet. So that's very exciting. And I want to talk to you about that journey from the point of view of the slice of time that we're in, and all the um, challenges that stand in the way, but also all the things that are truly thrilling about the steps to come. Truly sorry for the questions that were there earlier, which I've missed, and I'm going to explore why this happens. So let us have a look at how we're doing. Or let me make a small practical announcement. I think tomorrow I'm going to drop a community post on this channel, on the chat channel, with a few ideas about moderation. Moderation is sometimes a good thing in politics, sometimes not. But I'm talking about moderation here. And so on the YouTube channel, so my idea is that there could be about half a dozen folks who just very casually have moderation rights on the channel and are just bobbing along as they normally would, but just with that function, maybe just with a bit of an eye on the culture of the channel as well. So I'll share a little bit more about that. The last 3 lives so kindly Rachel moderated for us, and I'm so grateful to her. And in time, we're going to have a little bit more of a sort of a multi-person moderation setup. Let's go. Rachel, thank you for being here again, but I don't want you to work hard, please. Just hang out and you can leave anytime. Let's have a look at questions. If I don't see questions straight away, I'm going to give us a little bit of a summary of where I think we're at. James is saying, good question, Rune. Here's Rune. Where do you get your confidence in democratic institutions? As much as I believe in democracy as a political system, the last decade make it seem ever more fragile or incompetent. So the vision I personally have freaks a lot of people out, actually, even though my hope is to do the opposite, not to create panic. Um, and this vision, this image is really of democracies coming out of the bay. And whenever I share this vision, I'm actually visualizing a particular bay that I lived on in the South Pacific in Tonga. And so I'm visualizing little boats there in the calmness of the bay, and then they're coming out into open water with swells, with storms, and that's democracy. And what I am saying is that when that's happening to Western democracies, which it is now over the last 10 years, and it'll happen more over the next 10, 20, 30, um, we're not river going boats, flat bottom boats that are going to be tipped over during the first storm. So, what I'm saying is it'll get bumpy, it'll get stormy. We could make progress at strengthening our democracies even as they weaken, right? I don't believe in completely reversing this process because I don't think it's about moral failings on our behalf or lack of a clarity of vision. I think there are social forces that are causing democratic decline. We've mentioned them in passing a few times, but we will have deeper conversations about this. Um, so I think that that's how I balance it. I think that we're not going to sink unless we're unlucky. Um, but things will get bumpier, things will get harder. It will not be as easy to sustain the public good in our democracies in 2033 as it is in 2023. And part of the reason we're having this conversation um, is this, actually, right? Part of the reasons we're gathered here together is to have a kind of wherewithal, both at a level of efficaciousness, but also just at a level of um, acceptance, right? For when really big and scary cracks appear in our democracies. I think what we are looking at the moment is a situation where the preponderance of, you know, citizens in most Western countries will be unalert to the decline of their democracy, will be unawake to it. We don't want to do that, right? So, is that an optimistic vision? It's an optimistic vision because it says we're not going to sink, but it's not an optimistic vision in any kind of a teleological sense, which says, well, democracies are simply going to keep um, getting better, and if things aren't looking good, this is just an aberration from which they'll recover. I'm afraid um, there is no libretto to this historical process. It's up and down, and it depends on various social conditions. And these conditions are currently and for the foreseeable future are not going to be in our favor. Rob's asking, taking a long view of history, is democracy just a bib? I think that democracies are fragile, but don't forget, autocracies are fragile too. We certainly are very well exposed to the fragility of the Putin regime, but make no mistakes, there are real fragilities in the Chinese regime too. So it's not as though there is um, an alternate model of governance that's more stable than democracy that's available today. There is not. Right? But is it conceivable that in a couple of 100 years, there are going to be very few democracies in the world? Yes, just as it is conceivable that there are going to be very many. Um, so, what I think we definitely can be confident about is that there is no inevitability here beyond just those basic social forces that we need to admit, right? That do condition what is possible, that do limit the capacity of democracies. So that's what I would say. I would say that anyway, a richer definition of democracy, a richer conception of democracy, is one that is not entirely specifiable. It's something that we dispute about, even within ourselves, as we try to move toward it. But often we end up drifting further away from it. So we'll keep on drifting closer and further away. Um, but what I am certain about is that the next few decades will be difficult, and the climate challenge that we face will put extra pressure on democracies. Right? It won't make it easy; it'll make it harder. But hope is completely available, right? The hope that um, sufficiently truthful stories about our political arrangements will continue to sound not despair inducing, right? That's completely available. Let's have a look. Sebastian, I don't think an emotional event could get us back into the bay. I'm afraid it's too big. The forces driving this are too big. If this was something we could be woken up to, it'd be different. If this was something that Ukraine, with its at least in some respects resplendent solidarity, could wake us up to, that'd be different. But I don't think that's quite the reality we face. There are social forces untethering our societies that make democracy hard to sustain. Nico is asking, can I say have a happy holiday? I can say. I can say that. Fascinating question. Probably not going to take it now. How would Solzhenitsyn view where we are today? Ursula is asking about the Russia-Africa summit. Um, I risk overstating my expertise here, so I'm going to reserve judgment about what we're going to see. I think that, of course, one feature of summits like that is that they are largely symbolic. So whatever gets worked out is normally worked out before. But the broad pattern, at least from the Russian point of view, is that they are trying to moderate the degree of their economic and political isolation. And Russia is not that terribly politically isolated. Russia is, let me put it like this, Russia is more politically isolated than it is economically isolated. But its political isolation has limitations too. Chris is asking, lovely to have you, by the way. Can you see any possibility that shows a possible transformation of the fragmented condition of society that is threatening our democracies? No, not soon. Because if this is to do with how fluid our societies are, if this is to do with how atomized and segmented our societies are, and there are economic forces behind this. There are political forces behind this. There are modern ideologies of authenticity behind this, which are simply incompatible with any kind of rich ethical identity that stretches across our whole country, right? A whole culture. These are proliferating. The fluidity of our societies is only proliferating. The state of the internet is only intensifying whatever characteristics it already has that affect our way of going on politically. So the crisis of trust is a result, right? It's not just a kind of intellectual error that people can be snapped out of. It's a result of a lot of these forces, right? Which is why I say this somewhat provocative thing that in our societies there's a conflict between um, a genuine sense of political agency and truth for much of the population, and that I would say are victims of that conflict, right? So this is the kind of the anti, you know, some voters and they're dumb kind of outlook. So I'm skeptical about all of this, but what I do believe is that there are remedies, and these remedies above all start with this image of getting people to feel like they can touch politics. And I believe that political engagement at a local level can have an extraordinary and quite a miraculous quality. Now, could something dramatically change this? It would need to be such an outlier event that its occurrence would in itself be so dramatic that it would be a bigger worry than the fragmentation of our democracies, right? If aliens came, maybe we could consolidate. Um, if a very large object from space were um, an existential threat to the planet and heading our way, maybe we could change. But it would take something that dramatic to shake things up. Heather, thank you. Lorraine, how do you think it'll take? How long do you think it'll take for NATO to realize that Putin is already conducting a global war? How long will denial work to justify trickling assistance and prolonging the war? Um, let me be really, really sort of blunt with you. People have different opinions about this, but I have an instinct that if we gathered a lot of experts on Western foreign policy, a lot of experts on the capacity of Western democracies to mobilize themselves for concerted foreign policy commitments. A lot of these experts might say that we're already at peak support for Ukraine. Um, so when you say, how long will it take to realize that we need more? My answer is, it's actually possible that Western support for Ukraine will escalate. I think there are circumstances under which that could happen. But it's at the moment, short of intervening events, less likely than the reality that we are somewhere near peak support for Ukraine. How do I personally define that peak? I call it rather crassly a kind of independence plus model, whereby we're committed to Ukraine's independence plus a bit more. It seems to me that a commitment to a Ukrainian victory would look very, very different to the kind of commitment we have so far demonstrated. Um, and I think that there are some good reasons to be wary of Ukraine winning, but there are also some bad reasons to be wary of Ukraine winning. One of the bad reasons include the story that we could get something worse than Putin. This is not a trivial point to dismiss. I believe it's debatable, but my view very clearly is that it's an unhelpful argument to say, what if we get something worse than Putin, right? Then there are also worries about what happens on the Russian space. Could something really terrible happen on the Russian space that would be a greater threat to global security than the Putin regime? I'm skeptical about that. And a kind of a frivolous point I can make now, because it's a little bit demonstrative, but it's not entirely unhelpful, is to say that look at these folks in Russia, among the some of the elite circles, there's increasingly a normalization of a preemptive nuclear strike on the West. And I think that the people who say that this is complete chit chat, irrelevant chit chat, are wrong. That's just not the correct analysis of what's going on. Because when such discourse is normalized, it itself changes the odds of the use of nuclear weapons, I'm afraid. And moreover, when you see such discourse take place, and we'll analyze a couple of the instances, I think it's worth doing that on the chat channel. When you see such discourse take place, you know that partly it's a sort of a suck-up job. It's an attempt to mirror conversations that are happening elsewhere in the regime and try to fit in. So I take that seriously. And therefore, I'm not so impressed by the idea that we could get something terrible. I think that there is a nihilistic dimension to the Putin regime and to the way it thinks about its mission. And I think that that constitutes a direct, not just an indirect threat to our security. And so I'm very skeptical of the argument that, oh, it could be so much worse. I don't quite buy that. The arguments about moderation that make more sense and are worth engaging with systematically are arguments about nuclear risk. But as I've just indicated with this sort of cartoon of the normalization of the discourse of um, nuclear war, first strike. Yes, this is a regime that will be more likely to use nuclear weapons if it's losing, but this is not a regime that would only use nuclear weapons if it's losing in Ukraine. So I think that even the nuclear argument in itself does not constitute, on balance, a case against supporting Ukraine more. If anything, it may be the opposite. So, nevertheless, I think that we live in democracies. You can't support Ukraine unless you have a civic stability, a civic backing behind that support. Western politicians are realistic about that. And I think that what we're still suffering from is a real lack of clarity of vision. And I'm afraid here all the discourse that we see is unhelpful on all sides here, because what is often obscured is the need for us to imagine what we want to happen on the Russian space, and then say, well, what do we do to bring it about? Could be create extra conflict on the Russian space, constructive political conflict, by making it very clear who we will support under certain circumstances, right? Which kind of set of positions, which set of commitments. We could work much more constructively with the Russian opposition in this way too. So that's what I would say. But I think the broad answer, Lorraine, to you is pessimistic. It's that this may not, but this could be peak support for Ukraine. And paradoxically, the less well Ukraine does over the next few weeks with the counteroffensive, the more likely this is to prove to be peak support for Ukraine. So we're going to learn a lot in the coming weeks. But I think that there has got to be, from the point of view of somebody who is in a let's make Ukraine win position, there's got to be a mostly pessimistic answer to your question. Rachel, it's a fantastic question about dehumanization and the motherland statue. I think I want to have a separate conversation about this because it's really important to make enough distinctions. What I, in broad brushstrokes, think is going on is that Ukraine is giving us two models of identity politics. One, a very constructive model of identity politics, and the other one, a less constructive model of identity politics. The constructive model of identity politics Ukraine is giving us is a capacity to do some of what we seem to not be able to do around a sense of a plural society coming together um, into a sense of meaningful civic belonging, right? That kind of unity through difference is very important and it's very moving. And it'll be hard for Ukraine to keep sustaining it either post war or if the war becomes a long war, because the current government, in my judgment, doesn't quite have a deal with the population around what it means for this war to be a long war. At the moment, the Zelensky government roughly has a kind of informal deal with the population based on the notion that we're dealing with a victorious and shortish war. A non-victorious and long war, non-victorious in the sense of not returning all of Ukraine's territories, um, may require a different kind of negotiation. But this is the beautiful kind of politics, identity politics, Ukraine is modeling us. The other kind of identity politics is when there is a series of mutually parasitic positions developing on issues of decolonization and decommunization and derussification that do not necessarily lead to constructive political steps. And we're seeing some of that too. And Ukrainians are debating between themselves about the dangers of that kind of politics too. Genealogically, that kind of identity politics, the less constructive one, is actually not indigenous to Ukraine. In my view, it's come from the West. But this other very beautiful kind of identity politics is indeed Ukrainian, and we have to watch how the two develop. And that's why it's very important for Ukraine to keep on to keep on growing its conversation with itself in a way that is um, particularly open to diverse and plural and conflictive voices engaging without perceiving each other as sort of enemies. On issues of Ukraine. So one of the things that I'm afraid I'm very kind of brutal on is that we need more conversation about Ukraine all round. So of course we know who isn't talking about Ukraine, and these are the folks like Mr. Mearsheimer or Mr. Chomsky, who are not paying attention to this conflict except by looking at it from an altitude of 30,000 feet. Sure. But then I actually think that in the pro-Ukraine side, we're not giving enough time and space for a plurality of Ukrainian voices, right? Also acknowledging that Twitter is not an accurate representation of Ukrainian society, right? And then it's important that there is a growing, a widening rather than a narrowing capacity within Ukraine to give different Ukrainian voices place and space. for expression. Um, so we need more of Ukraine all around. Um, and one of the things that from the outside, if you asked me, that I would like to see more of is um, more conversations about Ukraine, displacing conversations about the badness of Russia and the not being Russia. So it's inevitable that we're going to have a lot of not Russia, not Russia, not Russia discourse in Ukraine. And I believe in the plurality of discourse. But at the moment, for every 10 not Russia comments, I want 5 not Russia comments and 5 we are Ukraine, and this is what positively we're about. This is where we're going. So that's very important. That's happening, but it's not happening enough. It needs to be encouraged. Needs to be encouraged more deeply. And that goes back to your question, Rachel, and that's that you cannot, for goodness sake, narrate your decolonization process negatively. This is what we're not. It's not going to work like that. It has to be also very positive and constructive. No, Lorraine, my pleasure. I mean, part of the reason I spoke at length is because it's a difficult conversation. I think my last sort of comprehensive treatment on it is the counteroffensive video on the main channel. I think now I've labeled it counteroffensive versus Western hesitancy. But I think we'll come back periodically with a kind of an update of where I feel we're at with what you're asking. So my thanks back at you. John is saying, didn't you once respond that because the Russian people, each individual under Putin, do not have political agency and therefore cannot be said to be citizens in their own country? Yes, I didn't just respond with that. That's still very much my belief. The fundamental crisis we're seeing in Russia, the political crisis, it's a moral crisis, is a crisis of depoliticization. And that's a crisis that engulfs many more Russians than the number of Russians you're going to find in a very clear pro-war or anti-war, in a substantive and clear pro-war or anti-war position. And the trouble is, of course, what's going to wake folks up, right? What kind of possibilities for politicization are there? And that's an ongoing question. At some point, politicization will occur, but it may require greater fractures in the regime than even what the Prigozhin mutiny exposed. Rob's asking, does Putin believe Russia would survive Western retaliation? So I think everybody believes that a global nuclear exchange is the end of most things that matter. But I do believe, as I argue in my video on Putin's thinking about nuclear apocalypse on the main channel, that there's an element, we shouldn't exaggerate it, but there is an element of something radical there that you also see in extreme ideologies of violence. And that is a special kind of distinction between before and after, implying that you can magically get to some kind of a positive after via cataclysmic before. That does not mean Putin wants to start a global nuclear war, not at all. But it means that there is a very dangerous psychology there that is more receptive to it than anything we've had before, actually. More receptive than you know, Khrushchev was at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev actually had a fundamental aversion to nuclear war. And we're not only lacking that, we have got some of these unhelpful echoes of radical ideologies of transformation. So if you ask me, um, how much does that dislocate sanity in Putin's thinking about nuclear risk? Is it sort of 2%? Is it 92%? I would say it's to the single digits. But these single digit differences matter when we talk about existential risk. Stützpunkt, appreciate you too. Jessica is asking how much of the world is depoliticized. Does this also apply to countries such as India, where hyper identities are being created? So, the depoliticization that is breaking out across the globe is not the Russian type of depoliticization, but it is a depoliticization that is partly caused by similar social forces, right? So when Russians ran to IKEA to do the last shopping before the war began, that was a reflection of certain global patterns of depoliticization, I'm afraid, just in a very intensified form. Roughly speaking, what Russians are experiencing is a catastrophic incapacity for normative thought about politics. That's to say, their normative thought is not broken, it's missing completely. And in a certain way, you might argue that that's worse than a highly conspiratorial voter in the United States who's off with the fairies, let's say. So in Russia, you have this incapacity to engage in any kind of normative thought. What we have in many countries across the world isn't that, it's just what I would call broken normative thought. It's normative thought about politics that cannot seriously stretch to notions like the public good or citizen belonging. It is a breakage in normative thought that precludes it from adequately attending to the fact that we're all in this together, for goodness sake, in each society. So these are two different normative aberrations. And the Russian one is this kind of normative incapacity. Our one is a kind of a normative capacity, but of a very fragmented sort. Hello, Bobby. Relative time works. What are your thoughts about the inevitability of the mix of laissez-faire capitalism and democracy leading more and more toward authoritarianism and fascism? Is this Putin's gambit? It very much is Putin's gambit, but it's also just Putin's theory of history, if you like. And this is what I call Putin's reverse Fukuyama position, that Putin thinks that there's a special inexorability to the decline of Western democracy. My sense is that we can do a lot to help this go better, but the natural drift of our democracies is toward populist authoritarianism. This is not to say that's where we're all going to end up. It's rather to say that's where the current is going, and we can, in some cases, successfully outrow the current. But I'm afraid to say that both in North America and in Western Europe, that's the drift. And the way to battle this drift is obviously, in the last instance, to stop politicians getting into office who are clearly set on breaking the democratic game, like Mr. Netanyahu is trying to do as we speak. But it's also about implementing mechanisms of democratic regeneration available to us. And it's also about trying to minimize and diffuse modes of political persuasion that actually aren't effective and do more to divide us than unite us. We want to minimize those forms of political engagement that make it all too easy for us to cast our political opponents as enemies. The natural, healthy democratic state is to see that your opponent today is a potential ally. They could be your ally tomorrow. And we've got to realize that certain modes of political engagement make us more likely to adopt this position, this healthy position of opponents, not enemies, and certain modes of engagement make it less likely. And of course, we're at grave risk of feeling that our disagreements are so deep that they're existential, which means that our opponents aren't opponents, but are sort of traitors to um, the central purposes of our societies, who need to be ostracized from politics because they present an existential threat to um, the sustenance of a kind of life that we want. And you've regularly now got political exchanges in Western countries where both sides seem to believe that about each other. And that is a very delicate thing to diffuse. I believe diffusing it is partly possible, but it's hard. And I'm afraid to say that the natural drift is there. But that does not convert into a prediction that, you know, 4, 5, 6 major Western democracies will all end up there in the years to come. That doesn't have to happen. Rachel, you are working hard. Um, all I can say is I'm very grateful. And you're saying that David has a very interesting question about philosophical collaboration. So I scroll up. Let me see. Can't see. Can't see. Rachel, thank you. Um, oh, you're asking, David, what is my philosophical view on collaborators? Presumably, you mean my philosophical view on collaborators, not on philosophical collaborators. And do you mean collaborators in Ukraine with the Russian occupiers, or do you mean collaborators on YouTube? I'm gonna take um, I'm gonna take it as meaning collaborators in Ukraine. Um, Obviously, I believe in due process, and I believe in not overinflating the definition of collaboration. Let me tell you a story that Isaiah Berlin loved to tell about humans in extreme circumstances. And the story is, in fact, an actual story that the Russian writer Ivan Turgenev wrote at the end of his life in 1883 or so in France. Um, and it was about how he went to study philosophy in Berlin as an 18-year-old. And what happened was that a couple of miles off the German coast, his boat sunk. And the vast majority of people were rescued. But extraordinary tales appeared about Turgenev's behavior or misbehavior on the boat. And there was the implication that Turgenev behaved in a cowardly way, that he pushed people out of the way to get into a lifeboat, and that he completely lost his head. And what Turgenev did in that story that he wrote at the end of his life, about something for which he was mocked all his life, was give a kind of account of it that made it out that we had a young boy there who was neither a hero nor a villain, um, neither a hero nor a coward, um, that in some ways he did keep his head. In fact, he didn't push women and children out of the way, but he did offer a sailor a lot of money to save him. He did panic a bit. He did lose his head a bit. And so what you get is just um, the complexity of human experience, the reality of a situation where it's pitch dark, there are flames roaring up into the sky uh, at night. Um, and there's a kid there who freaks out a bit. And you feel that, you can neither condemn him nor particularly praise him for extraordinarily heroic behavior. And so Turgenev just dissolves this. And so what does that story achieve? It achieves a milder, um, more humble conception of courage. And it's a conception that goes with the idea that we should not ethically judge people too much in extreme situations. That it invites the idea that the more extreme the situation that a human being is in, the less appropriate it is to ethically evaluate their judgment, the way you could evaluate their behavior, the way you could evaluate their behavior if they were sitting, on their bum at home on a Sunday, instead of doing something that was really their responsibility to do. This very much, of course, is an issue discussed in connection with the Nazi regime, right? But it's also an issue discussed in connection with every kind of extreme regime with which people collaborated. So that would be the moral texture of how I'd approach this issue. And in terms of the politics, of it. I want, of course, procedure, transparency, and sort of generalizability of treatment of people. I don't want arbitrary outcomes. So that's all I'm going to say about collaboration. YouTube being Mike, thank you so much. Franklin, Carol. I know it isn't your lane, but I'm sure you're aware of the US hearings on the aliens. What's your take on this? Um, mm, this is a little bit like the story about false flags in Russia. My attitude is not to spoil people's own opinions and speculations. I am personally very skeptical about aliens visiting us. And I have certain standards that are meaningful to me, that I uphold, which are really thresholds of evidence that need to be crossed for me to get exercised about it. So that's what I would say. I am skeptical. Lovely to have all of you with me. We're going to go till an hour and a half today, so quite a bit more to go. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. YouTube Mike says he believes in aliens. Cool. What are my thoughts about Wittgenstein? My thoughts about Wittgenstein are that I'm planning to do a philosophy Q&A. Wittgenstein was probably the most imaginatively forceful philosopher of the 20th century. Whether you are a Wittgensteinian or in many ways an anti-Wittgensteinian, as indeed I am. So I regard Wittgenstein as the greatest philosopher of the century, but I don't think he gives us the best resources of social understanding, as some Wittgensteinians think, including his follower Peter Winch. Chris is wondering what's keeping the West from developing a clear vision of what they'd want to see for Russia's future and a statement of complete victory for Ukraine. I think that there are several things holding us back. One is, of course, fear of nuclear escalation. Another is fear of something worse than Putin taking place on the Russian space. Another is a kind of attitude which says, let's just hope this sort of settles. Yes, we're supporting Ukraine very strongly, but let's hope this just sort of settles and goes away. So there is a kind of let's hope this chapter somehow manages to close itself. It's a kind of a passive psychology there. I think still very prevalent among public officials in the West. And I also think there's just tremendous lack of understanding of what is and what isn't possible on the Russian space, which stops people from saying, okay, this is what we want to happen. We think it's realistic enough for us to try to aspire to bring it about. Let's go. Gedas is asking, is NATO weaker or stronger post-Vilnius? I would say that NATO's position has some aspects of incoherence that are destabilizing. Um, they might be understandable, but they're destabilizing. So I think it's caricatural to say one or the other, but I'd be tempted to say um, weaker, but not weaker relative to there being no war, which of course consolidated NATO considerably. Michael is asking, if Russia loses the war, do you think the Russian Tsar would keep his life? I think there is a chance that he wouldn't. He certainly thinks that there's a very strong chance that he wouldn't. That's his ultimate fear, that detachment from power is detachment from life. That's Putin's very serious worry. And what I can say is that a comprehensive defeat in the war will make it extraordinarily difficult for this regime to stay in power. Extraordinarily difficult. And if and when this regime loses power, if Putin is still alive, then I do think it's possible that he would be at risk. Yeah. Let's have a look. Occam's raises saying that Zelensky's posture of increasingly being demanding about the West, needing to give Ukraine more weapons, may lessen sympathy for Ukraine. I'd preach a plurality of discourse here. So Ukraine can say, give now, but it can also say, thank you very much. The political analysis here in the cartoonish nutshell is that, yes, it's in our national interest to support Ukraine, according to my interpretation of the situation we're facing. On the other hand, of course, it is true that Ukraine is under more existential threat from the Putin regime than we are. And therefore, there is, of course, a sense in which we can save or not save Ukraine. So, yes, Mr. Putin is a direct threat to our national interests and to our national security. But at the same time, let me put it very bluntly, if we didn't support Ukraine at all from tomorrow on, and if this existentially threatened Ukraine's survival, as it would, and if then Ukraine didn't survive, you could still go and have a cappuccino wherever you are in the Western world, right? So that there is a significant difference there. Now, we then face the Mr. Putin threat more directly ourselves if Putin captured Ukraine, which is why it would be so egregious of us to allow him to do that. But there are differences here, right? And so there is, of course, a sense in which there is room. There's both room to say, guys, supporting us is in your national interest, but there's also room to say, you are helping us survive. Franklin Carroll, I promise to say more about Wittgenstein and answer your question on the philosophy channel, if that's okay. Human on Earth, is Russian nuclear saber rattling just something they do every few weeks? So there's a difference between two things. It's the main form of foreign policy for them, unfortunately, to threaten the world. If they hadn't invaded Ukraine, they'd have been also doing nuclear blackmail. It was increasingly becoming a central uh, bit of their diplomacy, quote unquote. And I talked about this in my last video before the war, that this would be a central part of Russian foreign policy. That's going to continue. That's just a lever they have. They believe it's worked. I believe they're right, that it has worked. And I believe it's part of why we're not supporting Ukraine toward a victory. But there is then this second dimension of the nuclear conversation, not just as a blackmail game, but as something that is being talked about excessively and normalized excessively in some elite circles in Russia. And that's something we need to watch and be very careful about, because that does genuinely change the risk algorithm for us. This sort of normalization, you know. Um, in the West, if we ask somebody, what's your political philosophy say about the next steps for the world, nobody in their right mind would say the delivery of a strike. But there are some people who are saying this in Russia. There are some people writing articles like that. And we'll talk about one infamous case from recent weeks on the chat channel. And that normalization can seem sort of comical, right? What's your political philosophy? My political philosophy is a nuclear strike. What do you mean a nuclear strike? Yes, a nuclear strike. And big explosions with intense temperatures. Now, that is what a lot of people are saying in some circles in the Russian elites. And so that's a worry. That's not good at all. And that does unfortunately alter the degree to which that disastrous regime is a threat to us. So that's what I'd say. Keep this sort of calculating blackmail and these sort of somewhat nihilistic turns in discourse, keep them apart to some extent. Dalton Everett is asking, regarding Medvedev's tweet earlier about using nuclear weapons, if the counteroffensive was successful, is this a real threat or just posturing? Well, Medvedev is doing self-preservation, but Ukraine progressively succeeding in the counteroffensive, particularly beyond expectations, is going to increase the risk of one of two outcomes: the collapse of the Putin regime or Putin using nuclear weapons. I don't feel terribly insecure about this analysis, I must say. I think that the more successful Ukraine's counteroffensive, the higher the risk that the Putin regime collapses, and the higher the risk that the Putin regime uses nuclear weapons. But I think we should be very careful, and I'm not being an advocate here. I genuinely think this is a bit of analysis. We should be careful to not jump from that conclusion to the conclusion that therefore it's obvious that nuclear risk can be reduced by Ukraine not dramatically succeeding in its counteroffensive. Nuclear risk maybe could be postponed by that, right? So we need to be careful not to get dissuaded from supporting Ukraine by that observation. And I'm not saying that in an activist capacity. I'm genuinely not. This is my analysis. I don't think nuclear risk goes away by appeasing Putin, roughly speaking. But it does go up in the process of making Putin lose, obviously. I think that that's an analysis that I'm not terribly insecure about. So that's true, but that's not much connected with Mr. Medvedev's discourse. Mr. Medvedev's discourse is supposed to talk about apocalypse. It's supposed to ventilate feverish images of the apocalypse to intimidate you guys. Basically, it's not even aimed at governments. It's aimed at you guys, so that you say, "Well, they're nuts. Maybe we should step back." But what I'm saying is that the nuclear discourse that worries me is not Mr. Medvedev's discourse. Mr. Medvedev's discourse is the same. He is raving on about the same stuff, week in, week out. But the proliferation of a, a more strategic debate in print about starting a nuclear war is is a worry. Mr. Medvedev's ravings are not a worry, as much as he would like them to be much more of a worry than they are. And frankly, Medvedev is comprehensively disregarded by us in the West, right? Nobody really is terribly exercised by his um, Telegram channel. Um, the sort of trivial answer, Geza, to your question about whether doing in Russia what we did in Germany after the Second World War would work, the trivial answer, I'm afraid, is no, because we occupied Germany. We're not going to occupy Russia. At the same time, um, poor Tim Snyder got absolutely eviscerated um, for several things he said in a recent interview. One of them was that over the last 30 years, we have not shown that we really have much capacity to influence what happens on the Russian territory. And for reasons to do with us not trying properly in various ways, and for us indeed influencing very dramatically what happens on Russian territory in other ways, people criticized him. But and what Tim was doing is being an activist with that comment. He was trying to get from A to B to C. So it wasn't a piece of expert analysis, nor was it a piece of um, public intellectual commentary, because it just would be too absurd as that. But he's trying to get to a, a destination where he thinks more people will support Ukraine. But not to get into that, what I want to say is I do believe that we can influence what happens in the Russian space by saying that if these things happen, we'll be constructive, we'll be there, we'll engage. If they don't happen, we won't, and we'll be really tough. So there is possibility for that kind of politicization. Um, Skalza in dead, no, Putin would not voluntarily step down um, unless it was shown to him that he would be forcibly removed unless he didn't. Then he might. Magaba is asking, is the counteroffensive about recapturing Ukrainian territories? It is. Or is it about attacking Russian territory? Does it involve both? So the West is not open to Ukraine invading Russia in any meaningful way. But the West is open. In other words, it'll continue supporting Ukraine if Ukraine engages various targets for military and political purposes on Russian soil. And today on Twitter, I shared a recommendation for us to not over moralize this. Or, in fact, I shared that as a very short video on this channel too, that this is just an inevitable part of the war. What I would say is that there's a kind of a prediction to be made there, and that's that the more the counteroffensive grinds to a halt, the more Ukraine will attack Russian territory. The more progress Ukraine makes militarily, pushing the Russians out, the less significant its aspirations will be to attack Russian territory. But the point of attacking Russian territory for Ukraine is to liberate its own territory, right? So it is a policy of the Ukrainian state to bring the war onto Russian soil, even though that sometimes these attacks are denied. But it is Ukraine's policy to bring the war onto Russian soil. But some of the aspirations behind that are about the idea that this destabilizes Russia politically, and therefore that might help Ukraine. That might weaken Russia. Russia weakens politically, its military might weaken, the military might experience some kind of collapse of morale and so on. So that's a brief thought on that. In a nutshell, the situation in Israel is that you've got a government there set on breaking the central counter-majoritarian institution that checks it. And therefore, Israel's democracy is in existential danger. That now Israeli citizens have the power to stop this from happening, probably. But it's one of those situations where it's one of the last moments to act. Right? If you let that run, you could be in trouble. So Israel's democracy is in a rescuable situation, but a difficult situation. And we should all care because Israel is disproportionately a major power. And you could argue that Israel is anyway undemocratic because of the violent occupation. But insofar as it is democratic in the other sense, that you have elections, you have counter-majoritarian institutions there, if it loses its democratic credentials, even in that sense, and becomes authoritarian, militarized state with messianic unpredictability, this could be bad for the region and for global security. So we do not want Israel to lose the democracy that it does have. And it's a critical moment. And it takes us back to the conversation we began with, that there are these critical moments that we're all going to face in our democracies. And we need to be aware that when they happen, we need to act because we still can act, right? We don't want to get ourselves to the level of, the Belarusian situation where it was too late to act, and where people began to act in 2020 now on the other side of the authoritarian consolidation, when the authoritarian regime was having consolidated itself, weakening and decaying. So these are key moments, and major democracies will face them. What I would say is that the more counter-majoritarian institutions you have, the more messy your democracy is, the better. So US democracy is much more messy than Israeli democracy. There are many more institutions, many more potential blocks to a project that might aim to obfuscate all democratic process, obstruct all democratic process. So, are Russians nihilists? Some of the nuclear thought of a small number of Russian elites is nihilistic, and some of the missionary ideas of Mr. Putin and some of the people around him, including the Kovalchuk brothers, have a nihilistic dimension, in my view. Bamboom is asking, wouldn't strikes on Moscow lead to further unification among Russians behind Putin supporting the war? Ukraine will seem as an external threat for real, as Putin says. It depends on each case. You could make the argument, some people have made the argument, that the attack on the Kremlin was so embarrassing to Putin that it rather undermined his aura of invincibility. We certainly know that the Prigozhin mutiny undermined Putin's aura of perceived legitimacy. Regular drone attacks on Russian territory may, however, have the kind of effect you are describing. They may cause a measure of consolidation, which may not be what Ukraine hopes for. But Ukraine is also in a position where it's trying to pull every lever available to it, right? The most obvious lever is to push the Russians back during the counteroffensive, but other levers are available, they're usable, and Ukraine will keep on using them. So part of this is sort of the politics of doing whatever we can do. That's how Ukrainians are thinking about this. That's how the West, interestingly, thought of the sanctions, right? We've got to do something. What can we do? Let's do this. So I don't have any special thoughts at the moment about this, Dalton. Evra, the Saudi Arabian Peace Summit. My big picture analysis is that Putin wants to freeze the war and then escalate later. Ukraine wants to become whole again, and the West wants to ensure Ukraine's survival short of Ukraine's victory. Under what circumstances could Ukraine and Russia be motivated to negotiate? I mean, they aren't obvious. And there are enormous pressures on the Ukrainian government not to negotiate. And Zelensky may feel that even if he were put into a position where he feels there's nothing else available, that he'd lose power doing that. I suppose there is a scenario that military experts could comment on. I would guess it's implausible. A scenario where the Ukrainian counteroffensive stalls and the Russians do an offensive that has a modicum of success, and then there could be some negotiation over further territory that might acquire. I don't see that as a likely scenario. It's not easy at the moment to imagine bringing the two sides together. And what I recommend bearing in mind here, and we'll talk about this more again, having talked about it a lot already, is that for all of Mr. Putin's desire to make the war a low-level war for now, his aspiration in the end is to escalate. And I believe folks in Ukraine understand that. So there is no deal of any kind that would stop Mr. Putin from escalating, right? Mr. Putin is not interested in this war stopping. He's interested in it sort of freezing, in being in some kind of a low-level phase, which then allows him to recharge his batteries. Pum. Tom, I don't understand your question that I refuse to talk about the aristocracy in Europe and how this affects dictatorships in the rest of the world. I'm not sure I fully understand that, but I think that if I encounter your question again with more explanation, maybe I will understand and have some thoughts or no thoughts. Cezus, I'd like to ask if you could comment a bit on the role of sport and sport management associations are playing in the politics of this war. I would say get two lanes of thought going about this. One is an ethical lane. Even let's take 3 lanes. One is an ethical lane, right? What ethically leaves us with an okay taste in our mouth, and what leaves us with a bad aftertaste. Then politically, what's effective, what's not effective, right? But the third lane is a kind of a lane of inevitability, right? Whatever the ethics, whatever the politics, they're going to be Ukrainians who don't want to deal with Russian competitors. It's just inevitable. So there's this lane of inevitability too. And I think that beyond that, my principal, cartoonish starting point, if you like, for talking about sports people who are not systemically tied up with the regime in any way is that they may need to oppose the regime and oppose the war and express that verbally. And that may be a constructive required step to participate in certain events. The trouble then is you can't do that from Russia. But there's an inevitability here. And I think it depends also on each sport. I'm probably more of an expert on commenting about events that include Ukrainians and Russians in the academic world or in the literary world, because there's been a lot of trouble handling that. So I probably have a better hold on my views, my recommendations for that type of thing than in sport. But again, I'd proceed piecemeal and I think about these 3 lanes separately: the ethical, the political, and just the inevitability. The inevitability that there is a war, and that when there is a war, unqualified, indiscriminate rage at the enemy, especially when they are 100% the aggressor, is understandable. Collective West saying what's happened in the academic world. Well, in the academic world, Ukrainians just don't want to be platformed with Russians very often. That's the problem. What do you think Nico is asking you would feel like if you stayed in Russia until now? Would you think any differently? Well, I mean, of course, sometimes if you have a particularly distinct personality, certain things are inevitable no matter where you are. But I mean, the central difference isn't that I'd support Putin if I were in Russia. I wouldn't, obviously, or the war. I wouldn't, obviously. The difference is that I'd be Russian, whereas um, whereas in my current um, cultural predicament, I am overwhelmingly psychologically not Russian. Um, I'm open to the way Russian identity inflects my personality, but it's like as a kind of a shade. Um, Psychologically, people see me immediately in Western Europe, in Central Europe. When I speak Russian to Russians, it's weird for them. Um, my Russian has limitations. It has no limitations at the level of comprehension, but it has limitations at the level of I haven't given a philosophy lecture in Russian. But I have probably less of an accent. I have less of an accent in Russian than I do in English. So I can sound kind of native, but people listen to me and they say psychologically that is an alien. That is an alien. So and what does the alien mean? It just means I have a Western psychology. My formation overwhelmingly took place in the West. So that's the key difference. I think that my 9 years in the Soviet Union, plus returning to that country, to Russia, plus connection with various bits of Russian history, Russian literature, mean that I am completely inside when it comes to Russian cultural understanding. I'm completely inside. I know exactly how everybody feels. But I'm not part of it, right? And actually people feel that very palpably. So that would be the main difference. I'd be Russian preponderantly, and I'm overwhelmingly not Russian psychologically at the moment. Given the biography that I've had. Stephen is saying Western consumerism or Russian nationalism, do they want McDonald's more than the double-headed eagle? There isn't necessarily a conflict. You can be absorbed in imperial fantasies and eat KFC. One of the myths we had that was proven wrong by history at the end of the Cold War was that eating KFC would disperse non-Western cultural materials, non-Western expressions of value. Let's have a look at what I've missed, and then we're going to round up a bit. Rachel, light-hearted question. Did your parents speak much English before moving to the UK? And if not, how was their language process different to yours? My father spoke English before my mother didn't. I myself, when I came to England, preferred to speak Hebrew, not Russian. So for the first year or two, my preferred everyday language would be Hebrew, not Russian. And I think I spoke Hebrew with my little sister But since then, I've largely forgotten Hebrew because I haven't practiced it. Um, and when I first came to this country, I was in a pretty rough school, which meant I just didn't learn the language um, until I began to read books. Let's have a look. Maybe there are super chats I've missed. I just want to check. I bet I've missed some, and I apologize if I have. Last question, and then I'm going to, with love and warmth, let you go. Dagunchi is asking, if Putin falls, would the new power hesitate to release political prisoners? Well, it depends how Putin falls, but we should insist very strongly that Russia releases its political principles for two reasons. One is that we don't believe in gross human rights violations, but two is it is enormously in our national interests, national security interests, in Ukraine's interests, for the Russian political space to become conflictual and activated, right? So the release of prisoners is a vital part of politicizing the Russian space. And that's why it's actually a very central, pragmatic pillar that we must insist on beyond any human rights considerations, which matter, of course, to Oh, here are a couple of questions that I've just missed. So there we go. I'll take those and then we will part company. Lorraine, so kind of you to repost. Hugo Lopez asked if NATO let Ukraine join and Ukraine gave Russia the territory it wants, would it stop Putin in the future? No. It would go a long way towards stopping Putin, but it wouldn't stop Putin because Putin, capacity allowing, would still want a major conflict with the West. And that doesn't mean he's going to he would start a direct war with NATO out of the blue, but he would want to do something, I believe. Capacity allowing, stability and power allowing. So Putin's plans for an escalation against what he perceives as a weakening West would not change if Ukraine became a member of NATO in a year. He would just say NATO is a weakening alliance, and when it's weak enough, I'll challenge it, and including challenging Article 5. Scano, last question. To what extent does the war in Ukraine weaken Putin's influence in Central Asia? Is there a chance China will take over as a dominant power? I do think it weakens dramatically Putin's regional influence. There is no doubt about that, because Russia has been evacuated not just of hard power, but of soft power. I think that the correct approach for anybody who is thinking clearly is to be cautious about being anywhere near this imploding empire, where lots of bits are going to fall off and fly off unpredictably. And we're going to see an increase of Chinese influence in Russia itself, of course, to the point of dramatic leverage, not just over Russia economically, but I believe increasingly over Russia's foreign policy too. Everybody, I'm very grateful to have had you with me. Rachel, thank you. And I'm going to see you very, very soon. I can tell you the title of the next video on the main channel. And it's been painfully slow to get it going just because of the infinitesimal amount of time I've had with my health challenge. But I'm thrilled about it, and it's going to be about how some of the Western left fails to get the point about Putin's imperialism and the need to support Ukraine. There have been a few written pieces about this. I haven't seen um, a piece about this in video form that's done the rounds, at least. We've talked about it a bit on the chat channel, but this is going to be a main channel video. So hopefully that's not 700 years away. Hopefully that's going to come. Lots of love and gratitude. And we're just beginning, but bye for now.